Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take your stack of sources, cut through all the noise, and really deliver the essential knowledge you need to be truly well informed.
And today we have a story that is just, it's a perfect case study for the times we live in.
It really is. It's not just about fraud or social services. It's about the terrifying, and I mean immediate power of the social media ecosystem to basically dictate national policy.
Right. We're diving into a really complex situation in Minnesota, specifically Minneapolis. It's a place where, these historical anxieties about large-scale fraud collided head-on with just a massive viral video.
And that collision triggered an immediate and frankly dramatic federal response.
Absolutely. The topic today is a whirlwind. You have a viral social media video alleging widespread childcare fraud.
And the claim is simple, right? It's
Yeah.
that these facilities were basically empty while collecting millions and millions of dollars.
Exactly. And that video, that one piece of content, leads the federal government to immediately freeze $185 million in critical annual funding.
For the entire state of Minnesota. Not just the centers in the video, the whole state.
The whole state. And our sources for this deep dive, they really covered the full spectrum. We've got the original viral claims themselves, the journalistic investigations that, rushed to fact check what was happening on the ground.
And then the high-stakes political fallout, the of really intense community fallout that followed within just, what, a matter of days.
It was incredibly fast. So our mission is pretty simple, but it's crucial. We need to unpack this whole accelerated sequence of events.
From the conservative influencer's camera lens, which got viewed over 100 million times, all the way to a policy decision made at the Department of Health and Human Services in Washington, D.C.
And we need to understand what allegations actually have some substantiation, what evidence directly contradicts the narrative, and, this is the big one, why this one episode in Minnesota is triggering a massive structural change in how social services are delivered across the entire nation.
That's what's so fascinating here, the sheer velocity of it. This isn't just, political opportunism playing out over weeks.
No. This is a case where one influential social media video becomes the stated justification for U.S. Homeland Security agents to start visiting daycare centers.
Which is intimidating in itself.
Hugely. Yeah. And then, the most dramatic step, the federal government freezes that $185 million. That's money that was meant to help, 19,000 American children get subsidized care.
It really shows that in the modern era, the speed of an accusation, especially a viral one, it just completely outweighs the speed of any official investigation.
It sets the agenda. Okay, so let's unpack this dizzying sequence of events.
Let's start right at the beginning, the spark. The moment the fuse was lit, which was mid-December, specifically December 16th, 2025.
That's the date. A conservative YouTuber, Nick Shirley, releases a video that it didn't just catch on, it just took the internet by storm.
It didn't just gain traction, it completely exploded. I mean, within days, you couldn't escape it, especially if you're on the platform X.
Right, and reports indicate it quickly accumulated over 116 million views.
Can we just pause on that number? 116 million. To give you some context, that's a viewership that rivals major televised national events, like the Super Bowl.
It's enormous. So a local allegation, something happening at a few streets in Minneapolis, was instantly given a global and highly influential platform.
And the core claim was, it was incredibly straightforward, very compelling, which, as we know, is the perfect recipe for going viral.
It was simple. Shirley alleged that nearly a dozen state-licensed daycare centers in Minnesota were engaged in this massive systemic fraud.
His initial claim, the number he threw out there, was that up to $100 million in government funding was being stolen.
And the premise was so visually powerful. His core assertion was that these daycares were taking massive government subsidies, money intended for childcare for low-income families.
Without actually providing the service.
Exactly. And his key soundbite, the thing that just stuck in people's heads, was that the daycare centers he visited were always empty.
And he didn't keep it vague. That's another key part of this. He specifically named and showed several centers in Minneapolis. He used them as his visual evidence.
Yeah, the ABC Learning Center, the Quality Learning Center, he put addresses out there, names. It created a very tangible target for public scrutiny.
And for federal investigators, it immediately focused not just the national spotlight, but the spotlight of federal agents onto these specific locations.
Which is why we had to drill down into the specific message Shirley used, especially at the ABC Learning Center, because the director there, a man named Ahmed Hassan, he provided security footage and context to WCCO News that Well, it paints a very, very different picture of that encounter.
Okay, so let's get into that. The timestamps on the center security footage show Shirley arriving around noon. Now, noon. That's an important detail, isn't it?
It's a very important detail. If you run a daycare or have kids in one, you know that noon is often nap time, or a lunch transition, or a staff shift change. It's not peak hours.
So what was his method when he got there?
Well, he didn't identify himself as, a journalist or an investigator. He seemed to fabricate a reason to be there, to try and get access under false pretenses.
So, trickery.
Basically, Hassan's recollection, which the footage confirms, was that Shirley knocked on the door and asked to check in a child. He was pretending to be a parent, trying to enroll his kid.
And a staff member responds verbally, but doesn't let him in.
Correct, they were refusing entry. And Director Hassan explained to the journalist that this is just standard safety protocol. You cannot let strangers into an active child care environment. It's a fundamental safety precaution.
Of course, but this is where the context gets even more crucial, right? Because Hassan noted that Shirley didn't show up alone.
No, this completely changes the dynamic. He had a team with him, up to 8 people, and some of them were reportedly masked or had their faces partially obscured.
Okay, so just picture that. You're a daycare worker, it's the middle of the day, a group of 8 people, some with masks on, shows up at your door and demands to be let inside.
That immediately ratchets up the fear and intimidation factor. Hassan explicitly said it set off huge alarm bells for his staff.
And he specifically mentioned recent activity by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, in the area. So this wasn't just a fear of a random person, it was a fear of being targeted in a law enforcement raid.
Exactly. And as we'll discuss, the environment in Minnesota was already politically charged because of ongoing federal fraud investigations. So when this group arrives unannounced, trying to get in, the staff's immediate reaction is one of extreme caution.
Self-preservation.
Yes. Which, ironically, Shirley then uses in his video as proof that they have something to hide. He spins the act of them not opening the door as evidence of guilt.
So the very understandable act of prioritizing child safety gets weaponized in this viral narrative.
Completely. And this really sets the stage for the enormous gap we're about to explore between the viral claims and the on-the-ground reality.
And that gap is exactly why we need to turn our attention to the professional journalistic investigations that had to follow. I mean, once a video gets 116 million views, news outlets are obligated to go and check it out.
They have to. They had to compare the influencer's narrative, that these places were always empty, that they were fraudulent against documented state records and, actual on-site visits.
So let's dive into what CDS News found. They conducted their own analysis of nearly a dozen of the daycare centers that Shirley mentioned in his video. They focused on 2 core things: licensing and state oversight. What was the reality?
Well, their findings immediately started to chip away at this narrative of a completely rogue system.
Yeah.
First, licensing. They confirmed that all but 2 of the centers featured in the video hold active state licenses.
Okay, so that's key. These are not like fly-by-night operations working out of a trunk. They're regulated entities. They have to meet certain state standards just to exist.
Right. And second, they weren't operating under the radar. The investigation confirmed that all the active locations had been visited by state regulators within the last 6 months.
They found specific examples of this, didn't they?
They did. For example, Sweet Angel Childcare, Inc. It was subject to an unannounced inspection on December 4th. That's just 12 days before the viral video even came out.
So state regulators were actively present. Now, this doesn't mean the centers were perfect, right?
No, not at all. And that's an important distinction. The CBS review did find genuine operational problems. They found dozens of citations across these centers for things like safety violations, cleanliness issues, problems with equipment maintenance, staff training gaps.
These are serious issues, things that need to be corrected. But, and this is the critical distinction that gets completely lost in the political firestorm that follows.
Despite finding all those operational issues, those citations for cleanliness and equipment, CBS News found no recorded evidence of fraud in any of the state records they reviewed for those specific daycare centers.
And that distinction is everything. A licensing violation for, say, having a torn changing mat is not the same thing as a criminal fraud scheme where you're making up children to steal millions of dollars.
Exactly. The viral narrative conflated poor operations with outright criminality. And the federal response, as we'll see, seems to have treated the former as sufficient evidence of the latter.
That's the central tension of this whole deep dive, isn't it? The political system reacted to the scale of the allegation, which was $100 million, not the scale of the confirmed evidence at the named centers, which, according to the records, was zero.
It is. So let's look even closer at that specific site that was featured so prominently, the ABC Learning Center, run by Ahmed Hassan. The video claimed it was always empty. So when WCCO journalists visited the center right after the video exploded, what did they actually find?
They found a facility that was absolutely not empty. Director Hassan is quoted as saying, "Every day is like this," and he's referring to a center that was actively engaged in services. They saw more than a dozen children there, several adult staff members.
And they were conducting basic language and math skills lessons. I mean, it was a functioning daycare. This directly refutes the primary visual claim of the viral video.
And what about that security footage? From December 16th, the day Shirley visited, he came at noon.
Right. And as we said, noon is often nap time. But the security footage from that same day showed a clear pattern. It showed families arriving to drop off children earlier that morning, and it showed them arriving later in the afternoon for pickup.
So the video's key visual proof, a facility that looks quiet at noon, was actually just a brief window between scheduled activities. It seems to be completely contradicted by the daily pattern of operation captured on the very same tape.
It suggests a very deliberate choice to film at a time that maximizes the perception of emptiness.
Let's also look at the specific regulatory history for that center, ABC Learning.
State inspectors had last visited on November 7th for a license review. And again, they did find ongoing citations. They're not perfect.
Right. Things related to, I believe, ensuring a care program was properly tailored for a child with a specific allergy. Real compliance issues.
Real issues, yes.
Yeah.
But they did not flag systemic, massive fraud. It just reinforces this picture of a facility that's under continuous state scrutiny for compliance, not a phantom entity stealing money.
But the collateral damage from the video and the frenzy that followed was immediate, and it was extensive. And it went way beyond just regulatory compliance. This is where the human element of the story just becomes heartbreaking.
It really is. It impacted legitimate users of the service. Take the Quality Learning Center, another facility Shirley featured. A mother, Fatima Noor, confirmed to a reporter she sends her children there multiple times a week. It's a functioning, necessary part of the community's infrastructure.
And the damage wasn't even contained to the daycare operators or the families who use them?
No, this part is just incredible. A woman named Fardosa Ali, who is just the landlord of the building used by the Quality Learning Center.
Just the landlord, not involved in the daycare at all.
Not at all. She started getting angry phone calls linked to Shirley's video simply because when outraged people Googled the address, the search results showed her personal website for her property business with pictures of her kitchen. She was completely innocent.
That is I guess, the perverse efficiency of modern digital outrage, isn't it? It doesn't just target the accused, it targets anyone even tangentially related, like the property owner.
It shows how carelessly these digital accusations can spread and just inflict so much harm.
And tragically, the hostility escalated way beyond just angry phone calls.
Yeah. Officials reported that one daycare facility in the area, and get this, it was a facility that was not even featured in Shirley's original video. It was vandalized.
Vandalized.
Yes, and worse, records of both employees and the children who attended were accessed, potentially compromised.
That is terrifying. And then there was the direct personal harassment.
Right. Director Ahmed Hassan of ABC, he showed journalists the voicemails he was getting. Some were, innocent inquiries about space for a child. But one was explicitly threatening. The caller expressed excitement to see him get arrested.
So people's lives are just turned upside down. Their safety is threatened simply because their business was featured in a viral video.
Exactly. So what we have is this high-stakes, high-view viral video with a very simple, easily digestible claim. But when you put it under the microscope of actual journalism, the core visual evidence is easily countered. And the official state records show operational issues, yes, but no specific recorded fraud.
And that is the very unstable foundation upon which the federal government chose to act.
And that action was immediate. It was historic. And you could certainly argue it was disproportionate. This is where the story shifts dramatically from a local controversy to a major national policy intervention. And it happened seemingly overnight.
On Tuesday evening, the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, they announced a shock move. They had frozen federal child care funding for the entire state of Minnesota, citing the fraud allegations that were sparked by that video.
To really understand the gravity of this, we need to detail the scope. The money in question, it comes from the Administration for Children and Families, or ACF. They manage the Child Care and Development Fund, the CCDF.
And that's a massive federal block grant program, right? It's designed specifically to subsidize childcare for low-income families so parents can work or go to school.
It's critical infrastructure for working families. And ACF provides Minnesota with $185 million in these CCDF funds every single year.
That money helps about 19,000 American children in the state, including infants and toddlers. So when you freeze that money, you're not just halting the revenue stream for a few accused centers, you are immediately jeopardizing access to care for thousands of legitimate families who rely on that subsidy.
The rationale was stated very publicly and very quickly by the Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services, Jim O'Neill. He announced the freeze on X, calling it a direct response to, and I'm quoting here, blatant fraud that appears to be rampant in Minnesota and across the country.
He didn't hedge his language at all.
No. He went straight to a very aggressive declarative stance. He said, "We have turned off the money spigot and we are finding the fraud."
The speed of this is what's just astonishing. The federal government used a viral social media post and some historical context to justify the immediate suspension of vital ongoing funding for an entire state.
And right after the freeze, O'Neill issued an immediate, non-negotiable demand to Governor Walz. He had to submit a comprehensive audit of all the allegedly involved centers.
So this is a federal order for a state to rapidly produce really granular data.
Everything. They demanded attendance records, current licenses, historical complaints, investigations, inspection reports. They basically said, give us your entire regulatory file right now.
But here's where this story gets really interesting for everyone listening, no matter what state you're in. Because the HHS action, it didn't stop at just punishing Minnesota.
No. It immediately triggered a national policy shift that affects all 50 states.
This is the long-term impact that everyone really needs to pay attention to.
It is. All 50 states will now be impacted by a new verification review system. And maybe the most significant structural change is this. The Administration for Children and Families Payments nationwide will now require what HHS officials are describing as justification and a receipt or photo evidence before any money is sent out.
Wait, hold on. Photo evidence for every CCDF payment. Can you just elaborate on the administrative implications of that? Because that sounds like a seismic shift in how these block grants operate.
It's a massive change. Historically, the CCDF program, it operates based on state oversight and a level of fiduciary trust. States verify eligibility, they track attendance through their own systems, and then they draw down federal funds based on aggregated reports.
So now, implementing a nationwide photo evidence mandate means that every single day care, whether it's in rural Idaho or urban New York, has to adopt and use a system to digitally document proof of service.
Potentially a picture of the child present each day, or a time-stamped digital log that's linked to every single subsidized payment. It's a huge shift.
That structural change requiring granular digital proof of service, possibly linked to photos, it fundamentally changes the relationship between the federal government and state social service delivery.
It imposes huge technical and administrative burdens on legitimate, often very small, daycare facilities. They're trying to solve a fraud problem by creating a nationwide documentation problem.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. You're talking about training tens of thousands of providers, many of whom are not tech savvy. You have to establish new national data standards. You have huge privacy concerns about taking and storing photos of children.
And you're creating a whole new layer of bureaucracy just to process what used to be handled with simple state attendance sheets. And on top of all that, Minnesota faces even more robust, even more difficult verification hurdles to get its funding restarted, just because the state has been designated as suspected of fraud.
And this wasn't just HHS acting alone. This was clearly a coordinated federal effort.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
U.S. Homeland Security agents were already active in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
They were conducting a fraud investigation they called Operation Metro Surge, and they described it as a massive investigation on child care and other rampant fraud.
The involvement of DHS is really notable here, isn't it? I mean, DHS, which includes components like ICE, is primarily focused on border security, counterterrorism, immigration enforcement.
Right. Their deep involvement in a financial fraud case immediately raised alarm bells in the community. The DHS secretary himself called the focus rampant fraud.
And the potential penalties being discussed take this from a financial story to, well, a constitutional one very, very quickly. DHS is considering plans to denaturalize citizens involved in fraud and deport undocumented immigrants.
That is a monumental escalation. Linking financial aid fraud, even large-scale fraud, to the revocation of naturalized citizenship is a severe and, frankly, rarely used legal measure.
And it ties the investigation directly into immigration enforcement, which is why Director Hassan and the Somali community were already so fearful of those masked teams showing up at their centers.
Precisely. Now, we did learn that the FBI was already investigating this seriously.
Mm.
FBI Director Kash Patel confirmed the agency had already surged additional personnel and resources to Minnesota before all the recent online attention.
So does that lessen the impact of the social media video, or did the video just provide the necessary political cover for this immediate drastic action?
That is the crucial question. I think the FBI's prior involvement confirms the federal government already have strong evidence of serious underlying fraud issues in the state. This wasn't built on nothing. But the viral video provided the urgency and the political justification needed to implement the massive, immediate funding freeze and that national policy change. The video was the accelerant. Patel even noted the FBI's belief that this child care fraud is just the tip of a very large iceberg in the state.
So to really get this, we have to understand that Minnesota was already a known high-risk environment for fraud. But it took a video viewed over 100 million times to force this huge national structural policy overhaul.
That's it, exactly. And to fully grasp why Minnesota became the target for this video and for this federal action, we have to connect this current crisis to the state's massive, high-profile fraud context. Without that history, the viral claims might have been dismissed. With it, they were given immediate credibility.
Absolutely. The rhetoric around these child care centers and the DHS visits, it's all happening amid this massive pre-existing fraud crisis in the state. Federal prosecutors have alleged a staggering $9 billion COVID-era fraud scandal.
Now, state officials like Governor Walz have hotly disputed that precise, expansive figure. But the number is out there.
And the anchor of this whole scandal history is the $250 million Feeding Our Future scheme. This is still the nation's costliest COVID-era aid scam, and it's centered on exploiting the federal child nutrition program.
And that was a state-run, federally funded program meant to feed vulnerable children during the pandemic.
Can you just quickly break down the mechanics of the Feeding Our Future fraud, just so people can understand the scale of ingenuity involved?
Certainly. It was incredibly sophisticated. It involved creating hundreds of fraudulent, temporary meal sites and then submitting massive, often completely fabricated claims for meals served to children.
So they were just making up numbers.
Making up numbers, creating shell companies to receive the money, and systematically exploiting the state's oversight mechanisms, which were loosened during the pandemic to get aid out quickly.
And the sheer volume of that case is just staggering. 78 indictments, 57 convictions so far. It's also really crucial to remember that the program's primary convicted leader, Amy Bach, is not Somali American.
That's a very important point. However, federal prosecutors have also pointed out that the majority of the subsequent defendants in related schemes, and this is across child nutrition, housing services, even autism programs, are individuals who identify as Somali Americans.
And this is why the political element here is so volatile.
It is. Earlier this month, a federal prosecutor made the extremely inflammatory allegation that half or more of the roughly $18 billion in federal funds that supported 14 Minnesota programs since 2018 may have been stolen.
Whether or not that number holds up under scrutiny, the sheer magnitude of these repeated allegations created a huge political liability for the state administration.
Which brings us to the sharp political back and forth that immediately followed the funding freeze, and it largely played out on social media. Governor Walz, the Democratic VP nominee, he pushed back forcefully.
His defense really centered on two things: accountability and politicization. He stated the state has spent years cracking down on fraudsters.
And he asserted that the current administration was using the freeze as part of a long game. He said they were politicizing the issue to defund programs that help Minnesotans, basically implying the goal was not accountability, but harming a blue state's social safety net.
And he's currently waiting for that official late January audit to give a definitive picture of the extent of the child care fraud.
Meanwhile, the current administration and the GOP moved very quickly to capitalize on the fraud cases. They connected these specific instances to really a broader targeting of a community. President Trump has repeatedly criticized Walz and the state, specifically targeting the Somali diaspora in Minnesota, which is the largest Somali population in the U.S.
And the rhetoric from some members of Congress just escalated dramatically.
Yeah. Republican Rep. Tom Emmer said on social media, and I'm quoting again, "Send them home. If they're here illegally, deport them immediately. If they're naturalized citizens, revoke their citizenship and deport them quickly thereafter.
That statement explicitly ties the fraud allegations, which, remember, are still unconfirmed at the named daycare centers, to a call for mass deportations and even the denaturalization of American citizens.
That level of response seems, well, it seems incredibly disproportionate to an alleged childcare fraud. It immediately transforms a financial fraud investigation into a major civil rights and immigration enforcement issue.
It absolutely does, and the community felt that impact immediately. Minnesota's most prominent Somali-American Democratic U.S. Rep, Ilhan Omar, she immediately urged the public not to blame an entire community for the alleged actions of a relative few.
And the fear on the ground is palpable. Umi Hassan, the operator of the ABC Learning Center, gave this really poignant quote, stated the community feels a sense of collective punishment when one person does something wrong. She emphasized that this crisis has created an environment where the entire community is now being held suspect.
And she even shared these concerns about extreme harassment and fear related to immigration enforcement.
She did. Hassan noted that in recent weeks, she and many others in the community have felt compelled to carry their U.S. passports everywhere they go, just because of the increased ICE activity and the severe rhetoric.
So they're worried they could just be swept up based on association or suspicion.
Yes. That fear is rooted in that ongoing Operation Metro Surge, which had already led to hundreds of arrests in the Twin Cities area. And this fear is now spilling over state lines.
Right. Washington Space Attorney General released a public statement expressing concern about home-based daycare providers in his state being harassed and accused of fraud amid all this highly charged rhetoric.
So the viral video and the federal response have effectively created this nationwide climate of suspicion, and it's aimed at home-based and family-operated daycare centers.
It really just illustrates the immense power of viral media to accelerate government action and policy change, even if the primary effect is to generate collateral damage and collective fear in the process of seeking accountability.
So if we synthesize everything, you've got the contradicted video claims, the historical fraud context, the immediate political weaponization of it, and the funding freeze. We have a situation where the consequences of the narrative are already massively impacting public policy and real people's lives.
So what are the immediate short-term and the crucial long-term implications here?
The most immediate and tangible crisis is that freeze on the $185 million. The stated intent is to combat fraud, but State Senate Majority Leader Erin Murphy warned that this abrupt funding suspension could trigger a collapse of the already financially stressed daycare system in Minnesota.
And she estimates this could affect tens of thousands of Minnesota families who need those CCDF subsidies to maintain their employment and afford basic care. So the goal of eliminating fraud creates a systemic failure in service delivery for legitimate users. It's a direct, catastrophic trade-off.
Precisely. This also highlights the governance challenge presented by the social media echo chamber. The commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Children, Youth, and Families acknowledged this tension. She said that while they take the video's concerns seriously, they simultaneously have questions about some of the methods used in the video.
So they're politically obligated to respond to the sheer volume of the public accusation, even if the evidence used in that accusation is, dubious at best.
Exactly, which is why the true extent of the fraud is still the essential missing piece here. And that underscores the vital importance of that audit demanded by the federal government.
That state's official audit, which we're expecting by late January, is the data point that will determine whether the federal government's reaction was justified or if it was a massive overreach.
We know the uncertainty is high. The director of Minnesota's Child Care Services Office was unable to say, with confidence, whether those allegations of fraud are isolated or whether there's fraud stretching statewide.
So until that audit is completed and analyzed, the entire national policy reaction is based on high-level suspicion, amplified by a viral video rather than confirmed, statewide evidence specific to child care fraud.
And that uncertainty has already set a clear national precedent. That decision to require all 50 states to provide photo evidence or justification for these payments. It suggests Minnesota's situation is triggering broader, structural, and likely permanent changes in how federal child care funds are administered across the entire country.
That new administrative burden is the most enduring legacy of this single event, isn't it? It fundamentally changes the delivery mechanism for child care subsidies nationwide. It creates a new standard where trust is replaced by mandatory surveillance.
Right. Minnesota's history of massive fraud provided the necessary context, but the viral video provided the political urgency required to justify such a massive national administrative change.
And what's fascinating is how quickly the scope of this expanded beyond just childcare. The administration seems to be using this one episode as a platform for a much wider multi-state fraud crackdown.
Oh, for sure. The White House press secretary confirmed the administration is considering similar fraud investigations in other blue states, like California and New York. They've noted a belief that systemic fraud is not limited to Minnesota.
So this crisis has provided the template for a sweeping national investigation into state-administered federal funds.
It has, and we are all left awaiting the audit data to see how much of that initial $100 million claim turns out to be fact versus pure allegation. The scale of the confirmed fraud, when it finally emerges, will be measured against the scale of the policy consequences that have already been enacted.
It raises a really important question. What happens if the audit finds a far smaller scale of fraud than that $100 million figure? The political rhetoric, the community fear, the potential for denaturalization, and the massive nationwide administrative policy shift. All of that has already happened.
You can't put that genie back in the bottle.
You really can't. So we started with a viral video alleging empty daycares propelled by 116 million views. We end with a federal freeze on $185 million in funding, impacting thousands of children, a major political standoff, and a national policy shift requiring photo evidence for child care services across all 50 states.
And we've seen verifiable counter-evidence contradicting the always empty claims at specific inspected sites. But we also have to acknowledge that serious historic fraud issues in Minnesota created the fertile reactive ground for this entire crisis to erupt with such devastating speed.
This deep dive really illustrates the immediate and immense power of viral media to accelerate government action and policy change. It often outpaces the due diligence of investigation.
It's a perfect case study in the dangers of the speed of influence.
So, what does this all mean for you as you process information and observe governance in this era? Consider this final provocative thought. In a political and media environment where a single, unverified social media video can lead directly to a major federal funding freeze and a change in national administrative policy requiring photo evidence for subsidized childcare, what responsibility should platforms and influential content creators bear for the collateral damage inflicted on legitimate operating businesses and vulnerable communities?
And what is the appropriate mechanism to balance the vital need for public accountability and fraud detection against the immediate destructive speed of public accusation and unverified narrative?
That is a fundamental tension between governance and the speed of information that we will all be grappling with as the audit results start to come in and the long-term impact of this new national policy becomes clear.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We'll see you next time.